Nice to see everybody and welcome to A Taste of Dyslexia. I first got interested in dyslexia when I started to learn the classical guitar, because when you're playing music you have to get the note right at the time you're playing it. There are no spell checks, there's no proofreading, so I had to realise how to work with my dyslexic brain and find out its best thinking strengths. I found then a lot of strategies that helped me learn how to play the classical guitar. Then I got interested in how does anybody else process information when they're dyslexic? What are their strategies? And as I started talking to people and trying to explain to non-dyslexic people what dyslexia is like, I found that people understood the words that I was saying but couldn't get the experience of what it is like to be dyslexic. So I put a whole range of simulations together to generate dyslexic effects in non-dyslexic minds. And that's what I'm going to do with you this evening. As I ran workshops, people wanted to know, well, where are the solutions? How can people manage their dyslexia and be effective? So then I started pulling together the ideas that people were telling me about how their brains worked. And gradually, I'm sort of a conduit from one dyslexic person to another dyslexic person of how to manage these brains that we have that seem to be working in different ways. And A Taste of Dyslexia is a workshop that has both the simulations and the solutions, but it also is going to have some talk about dyslexia itself. So the plan for the workshop is a section where I'm talking about dyslexia. Then I'm going to go into a model for communication, because after all, using language is about communicating with other people. Then there will be the activities, including the simulations, and at the end I'll sum up. I've got the definition of dyslexia from the website of the BDA, the British Dyslexia Association. Dyslexia is about difficulty with words. There is evidence that the brains of dyslexic people are wired differently, that the energy of where you're thinking is different from non-dyslexic people to dyslexic people. Dyslexia affects the skills that underpin learning to read, learning to write, and learning to spell. It occurs in people from all different backgrounds, people who can't read, and it is also applicable to people who've got university degrees. So across the whole range of intelligence, you can still find dyslexia. Dyslexic people learn differently and need to take a different approach to the way in which they're learning. It's a very puzzling phenomenon in that when you look at the list of things that happen to dyslexic people, then you can find one dyslexic person who is the epitome of a particular problem, but you can also think of somebody else for whom that problem has never been a difficulty. And you can think of others for whom it was a difficulty, but they've now worked out how to manage it, and so it's hardly ever evident that they have a problem because you can't see how they're thinking. It varies in degree and it varies from one person to another. So at sometimes a person who is able to manage their dyslexia, you don't know they're dyslexic. They're functioning fine. But at other times something happens and then they are almost as dyslexic as they ever were. It's noticed that there are distinctive talents that dyslexic people have. And when you find those, then you find where their strengths are for learning. So that's the present definition from the British Dyslexia Association. In working with students that I deal with, I often use this one that came from MacDonald Critchley in 1970, that a person is dyslexic if in some way he or she cannot handle words at a level that is consistent with her level of intelligence or his level of intelligence. That's much more succinct, more brief, and is easier to handle than a long list like the other definitions that you get. The other thing about that is that you can turn it up on its head and say to to somebody who's dyslexic that we're actually thinking about the dyslexia, the language that's a chaotic system, but we're also thinking about other intelligences. So on this plot here, we've got ability in an arbitrary scale in this direction. We've got dyslexia, language, and other intelligences here. So that we're looking at a discrepancy between the level of language that is evident and some other way of knowing that a person is capable of doing things, is capable of solving problems. And that this difference is surprising. Once you find out what the other intelligences are and you teach a dyslexic person the right way for their brain, then you can get language to be on the same sort of level as the level of intelligence. But what you can't do is get rid of the dyslexia that's matured, if you like, in the brain. So part of the thing that dyslexic people need to do in order to manage their dyslexia is have some mental energy reserved for monitoring what's going on in their lives, so that they're looking to see, is there a dyslexic difficulty coming up? What do I need to do about it? And take avoiding action, realise how to use their other intelligences. So that is something that dyslexic people have to learn to do in order to avoid the effects of dyslexia. So the main message is that not a dyslexic person cannot master language, maths, music, or whatever it is they're trying to do, but that a dyslexic person can only master these things by using the right method for him or her to learn. So that's the positive side. But we can't ignore what the problems are. And they are different in childhood and in adulthood. So when you've got a child, then you're looking at single word reading, you're looking at spelling or handwriting, fluent reading and creative writing. These are the ways in which dyslexia is noticed initially. By the time somebody has got to adulthood, they've more or less mastered those parts of using language, and it's organisation of ideas, general organisation, comprehending information, managing time and place, and keeping appointments, just the whole organisation of life. That is where dyslexia kicks in adulthood. Okay, so that's all I'm saying specifically about dyslexia. Now what I'm going to do is run through the Myers-Briggs model of communication. And we've got a flip chart there of it, which will be up all the time, but I also have it on the overhead. This is based on work by Jung when he was a GP, and he had patients coming to see him. And he found that there were very characteristic ways in which people were relating to him. Some people he called sensing people. They are people who work with the real everyday life. Other people he recognized as being intuiting people, and they work with concepts and with ideas. So just to put flesh and bones on that pair, somebody coming into this room would go round and look at the notices that are here and see they're all about German, they're about people. This is a room which is part of the language system in this school, and it's probably where German is taught, and that there are no symbols of any other language. That's what a sensing person would come in and look at. An intuiting person would come in and from the same posters see, German. Yes, what's in the news? What's going on in the European common market situation? So that very quickly an intuiting person would think about what's going on in the world situation and would not stay with what's in the room. Then there's also a thinking function and a feeling function. A thinking person wants to make their decisions depending on how logical, how efficient, what are the systems involved in a situation. Feeling people want to make their decisions based on how the group dynamics work. What will make me feel good about myself is what they'll be thinking about. What would make a group gel? How can we get relationships to work? So that's the difference between those two mental functions. And you can hear that sometimes where you've got a committee meeting going or in a staff room situation. You will have the people who've got to come out with the truth as they see it, the thinking people, and you have the others who want to make all their comments in terms of what will make people feel good about themselves, and they find it very difficult to come out with the sort of logic, the efficiency of a situation. Another dimension that Jung recognised was that some people relate to the world around them by always wanting to gather information. They want to keep going even when they've got enough for an essay. They just think the next book, the next leaflet is going to have that piece of information that is going to make their work really spot on and beautiful. There are people who make their decisions very fast. They're judging people. They don't particularly want to go gathering information. They want to come to closure. They want to make a decision and get on with things. So that is a difference that he recognised in people. The most commonly known difference was that between extroversion and introversion. Extroverted people like to be in dialogue with the world around them, either with objects or with people. Introverted people like to have their inner world sorted out before they come into dialogue with the world around them. And you can see this in a group, particularly when you're teaching a group of people, because you'll say something and the extroverted people immediately start talking to their neighbours. They've got to sort their ideas out with the small group around them. The introverted children or people will sit quietly, work out their ideas, and then once they've sorted out their ideas, they will come into dialogue with the world around them. So, what's this got to do with dyslexia? I just want to make sure I cover everything. Yes. The ways in which you teach dyslexic people, multisensory, which is the sort of thing that sensing people like to think about and work with. Also, the logic. That is very important to quite a lot of dyslexic people, and there is logic in language. So the sensing and the thinking are two strands that are very prevalent in ways that are useful for teaching dyslexic people. Then the introverted nature of thoughts is very important. Very often with a dyslexic person, you see a spelling mistake and you can get that person to do a lot of work on the spelling, but until you work back to where there's a confusion in the brain, you don't get any shift in the spelling pattern. And this was brought home to me in my own brain when I suddenly realised the difference between envelope and develop, because I always had the instinct to put an E on the end of develop and to put one in development. And it wasn't until I realised that I was confusing the letter pattern in envelope with the letter patterns that you get in developed that I could sort those two spellings out. Any amount of writing those two words out just didn't get through to my brain. So actually working back to where the nub of the problem is incredibly important. What I will be doing in the activities that I use to show you dyslexia is splitting the connection between the sensing part of language and the intuiting part of language. There's a lot that I use this model for as far as motivation is concerned, but I'm going to come back to that right at the end of the workshop. Some final comments that I want to use this model for is to talk about the way the senses relate to each other. And I think we often assume that all the senses will work together, that doing things, seeing things, hearing or speaking will actually coordinate together. And many dyslexic people have told me that often for them only one will work at a time, particularly when they're really working hard to understand something. So that somebody may just be hearing something, or they may just be seeing something, or they have to concentrate on what they're doing. For instance, if you take somebody to a concert where you've got Handel's fireworks playing at the same time as there is a fireworks display, then quite a few dyslexic people can either hear the music or they can see the fireworks, but they cannot do the two together. The two systems simply don't work. For me, when I'm learning the guitar, I have to have everything completely lined up when it's a new piece of music. Even my metronome has to be lined up so that I can see the fingerboard, the piece of music and the metronome, because when I'm really concentrating, I can't hear the tick of a metronome. I have to see it at the same time, otherwise I simply don't learn that piece of music. So those are some of the stories about sensing. My final one was a child I was working with, and he was reading for me, and he came to the word do. He was about 7 or 8, and he said, "D," and looked at me and couldn't go on. Well, he said, "I've done this word with my teacher at school." And we actually had to talk through that the word he had done with his teacher at school was exactly the same as the word that he was now reading with me. He couldn't just pick it up from school and move it to another place. And quite often, there's good psychological research done into this, that the place that you first learn something is very important in the memory. And if you learn the spelling of words in one place, you learn the meaning of words in another place, you go and do some modelling about the same subject in a different place, then those are all separated in a dyslexic person's mind because they have been done in different places, and you need to actually talk through that they are connected. So that's something that I've learnt from talking to other dyslexic people about the way in which senses work with us. Okay, so now we get to the first place where you need to do something, because I don't like to do all the talking. What I'm going to ask you to do now is a mind exercise. And what I want you to do is, on the piece of paper, does everybody have a blank piece of paper? Maybe we could pass some around because not everybody has. I want you, okay? I want you to take a colour or a shape and put it in a circle. Doesn't matter what colour or what shape. Put it in a circle, and then I will give you 1.5 minutes just to collect ideas that come into your head. Now, what I want you to not do is allow your minds to spiral out. So you don't think square, town square, Bond Square, Central Library. Have I got time to renew my library book before the family come in for tea? You've got to stop that spiralling out and make sure that everything you write down is related to the colour or square that you write down in the middle. Then after I've given you 1.5 minutes, I'm going to say pens down, and at that point I want you to put the pens down and just concentrate on what you have written down. Maybe concentrate on the colour or the shape that you've put in the middle, and hold your mind on that for a minute. And after you've done that, then we'll talk about what your experience is and what you've found and why it's related to dyslexia. Okay, so go. Okay, pens down. And just think about what you put in the middle. Okay, pens down. And just think about what you put in the middle. Okay, so how easy was that to do? How easy was it to keep your minds in one place?
Not very easy at all.
Not very easy? Did anybody find it easy? Not too bad. It's usually easy for people who've done yoga or meditation or some of the martial arts, or people who focus on sport and have to have very good attention. Yeah? But you can observe your thoughts and see whether you're concentrating on the central idea, can't you? Yeah? And in the first part, how easy was that to do? What, could somebody give me an example of what?
It wasn't easy because you put one thing down and you wanted to continue it going out, and you couldn't. You'd got to stop and do something completely different. So the way we think is...
Yes, it is. But it's very useful to be able to stop and just direct your mind. What did you actually think of?
Triangle.
Yeah.
And the first thing I thought when I knew what the task was I wish I hadn't picked a triangle. Yes.
Yes, and then
3 sides, pyramids, vampire teeth, pencil grips.
yeah.
Equilateral, right angle, and then it made me stop and think, because once I started going down that route, I was thinking, no, they're all linked, aren't
They're all linked, yeah.
So I shouldn't be doing it.
Well, but except for they are all directly linked to triangle. Yeah. How about anybody else? Something?
Okay. Well, yes, I chose blue, partly because I just had a cataract removed and I'm very overwhelmed by the blueness of the sky.
Right.
So I wanted to write sky all the way around it.
Yeah.
But I got sky, I got paint, I got flowers,
Yeah.
And then I found myself thinking of flowers, and I'm not sure whether I wasn't then. I was thinking of flowers that blew, cornflowers and
Yeah.
bird's eye. And then I thought of space.
Mhm.
Was that about it? That sort of thing. Crayons, paint, rainbow.
Okay. Where does this come from? Is that from maths? Is it from associations? Are you seeing things?
Well, I was thinking mathematically, but then I thought about vampire teeth, because that, if you turned it the other way, that's what it looked like.
Yes. So, but that's still visual, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where are these coming from?
Indeed, yeah.
Those are
I
also.
was conjuring up every time I did it. I saw the thing.
Yeah.
I know I do.
Yeah. Did anybody else have a collection of things that they think were not visual? Yes?
I had blue as well,
Yeah.
but it's entirely verbal. So I had the pop group blue, blue cheese, blue sky, Oxford blue.
What was it? Oxford blue. There was another one. Blue cheese. Okay. Whoops. Right. So the power of this exercise for dyslexic people is the skill of being able to watch your thoughts and see, are they connected with what I'm supposed to be doing, or have I gone off on a tangent? Because one of the things that's very frequent in dyslexic people is that they go off on a tangent, that their sentences don't end, they start another sentence, their paragraphs just weave backwards and forwards. They don't have the ability to stay on task. So that angle of being able to see what you're thinking is tremendously important. To focus and to concentrate is tremendously important. But this is also very, very useful in that when you start to look at what people have clustered together, what automatically comes into their minds, you can start to see where their strengths are. This is somebody who's verbal on the sensing system. These are two visual people. With other connections, you may get personal experience. You may get logical associations. So analysing the way in which people have thought when they have done this sort of exercise allows you to start to explore how individual people think. And we have two different responses just to the colour blue. And if we go and compare at greater length, you find a lot of differences in the way in which people think. And it's very, very important. So that's the beginning of finding out how different people think. Okay, so now we get to the first exercise that shows you something of what it's like to be dyslexic. And could I ask somebody to read to us? Can I have a volunteer? And this is what she's reading.
Of course, the farther north you go, the emptier the roads. At last you fetch clear of the forest and climb bare hills where wolves howl in the ruins of our cities. They have been. Now, my pretty girls, now my jolly magistrates. He knew your father when he was young and invite you to stay with them. No news at the temples and way stations except bad news of wild beasts. There's where you might hunters and trappers for the Caucasus prodding along chained bars and muzzled wolves. You pony shies at them and your men laugh.
Do you want to go on? How was that?
Well, I could read it.
Could you understand it?
If I would have stopped to reflect on the sentence as I read each sentence, then it would have made more sense. But
It's difficult.
Yes, it's difficult to read it and understand it
Yeah.
going along.
Yeah, and there was sort of no inflection in your voice that gave any sort of understanding to the sense. And how about sort of scanning over it to get the whole context?
I couldn't because it was so strange to read. I wasn't scanning ahead. I wasn't backtracking for meaning. I was just reading the words as I got to each word.
Yeah, which is exactly what reading is like when it goes difficult for dyslexic people. We read one word at a time and have enormous difficulty in collecting up the whole context and checking that the words are correct. There's very little ability to scan over a passage and work out what the context is and use the context clues to check whether you've actually picked up the right word or not. Yeah? And how did you feel doing it?
Well, I was conscious that I wasn't reading it correctly, so I knew all the time I was making mistakes, but...
Yeah, but you're an adult, and
I wouldn't have liked it if
you
I
wouldn't.
was 7.
No, and that's where that's very typical of the sort of problems that dyslexic people face with reading. And because of the slowness and the difficulty with it, it connects with all the difficulties in reading here on this chart of symptoms and problems. It also connects with the emotional disturbances and the behaviour problems, the hyperactivity, the petrification, the freezing, the children who see it's their turn and that's when they become disruptive, or that's when they need to go to the loo or have any sorts of excuses to get out of reading. Even when students are at university and have got basic reading skills, they are still struggling at that sort of level to cope with the texts that they're having to read. Okay, so that's part of what reading is like. Now I want to give you another activity. And here, in this one, we've got real and line written in 2 different ways. They're written once in completely joined up writing and once in 2 different pens, one showing the letter shape and one showing the link between the letters. So the activity is for you to write jump and walk and stand in these 2 different ways. Is that okay? Can you see enough there? Yeah? Okay, has everybody done at least one word in 2 different ways? Yeah? So the first question is, who is thinking about jumping, walking or standing while you do the exercise? No? What are you thinking about? Joining letters.
Trying to remember where to join them.
Yes. Okay, so somebody who's dyslexic is focusing on what they're trying to write and not understanding the context of what they're doing. So this is very definitely splitting you from the sensing side of communication and the intuiting, the context side of communication. It's divided you in those two ways. And what will happen is that a child will do the spelling, copy it correctly and get it right, but because they haven't been internalising the words, when they come to use them the next day in some work, then the spellings are not connected with the ideas that they're using, and therefore they spell everything incorrectly again. Linda asked, can you do it by writing the letters and then joining them up in two separate ways? But if you did that, you wouldn't get the smooth beginning to end of a word laid down in your neural networks. So you wouldn't be creating the complete sequence that you need for writing the words, would you? So you'd present the work to your teacher, you'd be doing the task and it would look good, but actually you're doing it in a way that doesn't produce the right learning in the brain. And I've seen a child who was given a page of spellings to write out, some 20 spellings to do 3 times, and he went and did all the first letters, all the second letters, all the third letters, presented his teacher with a page that looked perfect, but of course it wasn't learning the spelling in any way at all. And people who find that they're not learning effectively and are repeatedly given these sorts of tasks will buck the system if they can, particularly the intelligent ones. So they will find another way of doing something. And nobody knows that they're doing it in a way that doesn't allow the language that they should be learning to mature in the brain. So you have to watch what people are doing. Okay, so that relates to...
So with the jump, if you wrote the jump and then jumped, would that make you remember the spelling better than just writing it cold?
It could well do, providing you made the connections. And providing you were somebody who the kinesthetic sense was really important for. And if the kinesthetic sense, the doing sense, doesn't make any difference to you, then it would be probably pointless. So that's why you have to work with the individual way in which a student learns or a pupil learns. But if you mix everything together, then hopefully people will be able to learn by the way that works for them.
Can I just ask, my little girl's 8 and she has spellings every week which she struggles with, that's her worst thing. Preference, she would write each letter individually, but the school want her to join, and she does seem to be concentrating so hard on the joining of the letter like you just said. Would it be more beneficial for me to say to her, we'll do it as single letters? Would it go in easier for her to do that, or is the joined up way?
It's what you want. It is the most fluent way of writing at the end of the whole process. So if you can talk her through that and help her to look further on, then she might be able to go through the process of joining up.
It just seems too much for her at the moment to do it all, like you're saying.
Yeah.
She has to concentrate so hard on the joining that she doesn't even know what the word says.
Yeah. So, well, the teacher I know who's had most success with handwriting and spelling, and who eventually got her schools so dyslexic friendly that they were catering for them very naturally, what she did was blindfold her 5 and 6 year olds when they came into school in the first place, have a huge piece of paper stuck down onto the page, onto the desk, and then said, write as large as you like and don't make it small and neat, until they got the motor movement in, and then she started to get them smaller and take the blindfold off. But she found, she was working from the principle that you need to go from the word to knowing the motor movement. And she did it that way. Some do it by tracing, having the complete word actually cut out in sandpaper, and then a child moving their finger over that until they've got it into the motor memory, and then picking up a pencil and doing it. So they've actually got something to do the initial patterning first. So try that and observe, is this a child who likes doing things? And look for a doing way of getting that to work.
So is writing then a bit like playing the piano? If you want to learn a tune, your fingers have to remember it. It isn't your brain.
Yeah. Yes. And then it goes into the cerebellum at the back of the brain and is an automatic piece of information that the brain uses. You think of the word and out it comes. That's the way it's intended to work, and very rarely works for a lot of dyslexic people. Okay?
And you think the joined handwriting would, in the long run, be beneficial because the flow's
Yes.
better?
Yes, and I wouldn't go through a stage of teaching single letters first. What Elizabeth found was that you go with joined up writing straight away and don't go through the process of teaching individual letters and then having to put the link in.
Because in some schools, every letter starts on the line. So you start from, even if it's a C, you start there and you go up and round and back.
Yeah.
But for the majority of schools, they're teaching single letters.
Yeah.
So of course, every letter could be starting in a different position.
Yeah. But if you always start in the same place and you go with the joined up movement straight away, then you're putting in the most efficient patterns very early on. Yeah? Okay, so on the chart of symptoms and problems, then what we've just done underpins all the writing problems that you have. The spelling, the poor handwriting, minimal punctuation. In adults, it's that people have difficulty writing checks, signing checks. People will write in simple words because they don't know the complex words, even though they use the complex words when they're talking. As people get older, then you have the reverse situation. You're not thinking about the letters and the joining so much. You're thinking about the concepts and the ideas. And when you're trying to proofread your work, you don't see that what's on the paper doesn't bear any relationship to what you thought you had written, because as you proofread, you're reading your mind, and it's wonderful. You've got your ideas down there that's clearly expressed, everything's in the right place. You hand it in expecting a good B at least, and then I get very disappointed when you get a C and loads of comments all over it. And a week later or so, you can read what's on the page because you have forgotten what you were trying to express. So that's the reverse side of the activity that you've just done.
So with a younger child then, if they have done a piece of writing, there is no point on that same day making it edit and redraft it.
No.
Because unless there's some gap there, unless you wait a couple of days and then look at it, then all they're going to remember
is what's in their head.
They think's on the paper.
Yes. Yes. And I get dyslexic students to learn how much time they need to leave before it's safe to proofread.
It doesn't help in exams though, does it, Julie? This is the difficulty.
There you have to use other tactics. You have to focus on your ideas. And you have to check ideas and do it that way. And that's why in exams it's so important that the expression and the spelling are not marked down. Yeah, because it doesn't. You're right. Okay. So some things to say about spelling, because it does matter and it does help with reading if you know how spellings work. So working in simple sentences, what I do with students when I'm working on language is I actually work with text that they need to read, they need to understand. I never do anything away as a language exercise in its own right. It's always in context. The look, say, cover, write, check is very important, and it's very important to get dyslexic people to do their own thinking. Very often you have people who will do some work, and then to judge whether it's right or not, they look at your face and try to gather from your reaction as to whether they've got it right or not. So they're not doing their own thinking, they're not doing their own assessing, which means that when they've got to do it from themselves and you're not there, they haven't got anything to go on. So it's very important for them to do it themselves. And you can see that this is multisensory. You look at and name the letters and go over somebody else's writing. You say the word so that you're linking the pronunciation with the word. You cover so that you're writing it and doing the exercise from what you remember, and then you check against a blueprint to see whether you have remembered it or not. You don't copy it from something that you're looking at. I have had children say to me, look, you do the spelling, you tell me how to do it. You tell me the letters. And I'll say, no, it's got to be in your brain. And then say something, look, we've got an apple here on the table. If you're hungry, it's no good if I eat the apple. You've got to eat the apple in order for your hunger to be satisfied. And it's the same with spelling, with working with words. It's your brain that's got to know how to cope with it. It's no good trying to use my brain to do it all. Then repeatedly taking a collection of words that you're working on and checking them and just doing a few spellings at 5-minute interval, not 5-minute intervals, but 5-minute times, several times during the day until you've got them, and make it as fun as possible, obviously. So that's some of the ideas about spelling.
I'd add one more thing to that cover right check. I'd get kids to say the letter more loudly, the one that they tend to get wrong, or
Right.
because we analyse it first of all and say, look, you've got nearly the whole of this word right. It's just that you have got to use a Y there, not an I.
Yeah.
So we come to it, let's first of all highlight it, and when we come to it and you say it, could you say that one louder, really shout it out?
Yes.
And that often works.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. Spelling rules, and there are rules in spelling, and for the logical children and adults, then knowing how words change from one to another actually helps them to understand what's going on. So those are very important. As part of getting people to think for themselves, marking spelling in the margin so that they know the line to look at, so that they can then work along the words and see which one is incorrectly spelt, so that you're stimulating their thinking, is a much better way than actually marking every single one that has been misspelt. So I have an example of one exercise we did with students at Brooks. One came and said, well, how do I learn to spell schizophrenia? So the first thing we looked at was, it's made up of 2 words, schizo. Wherever you meet schizo, it's the same word. So you've only got to learn that once. Phrenia comes from a word that means mind. Then we analysed, as you were saying, the individual bits. School, the SCH is like school. And one student said, oh, that makes it friendly. I know about school. I can cope with that. And I said, that sound like it's. It's actually a Z, which is a non-English, non-standard English word. So it's like Mozart and other words like that. So that starts to make it less frightening, because you know it shouldn't sound like ordinary English words. But I always leave this bit in, because saying what it's not like is unhelpful, because then as you work along something, you've got a bit that you've always got to cross out. And when you're working with sequences to help with spelling or any other task, you always want to stay with the positive thing that is going to help and not put any explanations in that then will need to be moved and left out all the time. Also saying that the PH is a single letter in another language and makes the sound F was useful. And then to recognise that there is a family of words that all belong together. You've got schizophrenia, the disease, you've got schizophrene, a person with it, and you've got schizophrenic, where the E at the end there has changed its sound, although the spelling hasn't changed. And for people to actually look at that and see that that has happened and work with it and not be fazed by it every time they're working with these words. This is obviously a nurse who was having to learn these words. But you need to know those sorts of things in order to work with language. And then you have a blueprint in your own handwriting that you check against, and you practice those words until they're automatic. You think it, you can spell it, and it's got into motor memory, as you were saying. So, I just want to show you something about the way our minds process what we see. Now, what's your reaction to this face here? It's upside down, yeah? But the mouth isn't.
It looks as though it's smiling, actually.
Yeah, but it, you know, it's quite nice. You wouldn't mind meeting this person. No. So if I turn her upside down. Okay? It's quite extraordinary, isn't it? Completely changes. The only person I've known to see the real face upside down was somebody who's very, very dyslexic. Now, what's happening when the face is this way? Because our brains are wired to deal with mouths and eyes, you see a smiling face in an upside down, you see a smiling mouth in an upside down face, and you think that's okay. And you're not aware that your brains are computing what you see and making something quite different from the reality of the picture. Okay? You can't see that in your brains. Dyslexic people don't see when their brains are doing things with words. They don't see when the words are jumping around. They don't see when letters are being transposed. They don't see when they're struggling with the alphabet, what's going on. So there's all sorts of ways in which the dyslexic mind is producing communication that is not effective, but you simply don't see until you've got to the wrong place, you've done the wrong bit of homework, you've written the wrong essay. You don't see until the end product that you've actually interpreted the world and the language in a totally different way. So there's lots of ways in which that relates to what's happening in somebody who's dyslexic's mind. On the list of symptoms and problems under reading, we've got anaesthesia, going to sleep, which is something that happens to dyslexic people a lot. It happens to non-dyslexic people when they want to go to sleep at night. People often pick up a book to read. Now, what happens is that when we don't process information effectively, there is a whole range of systems within the body that are designed to send you to sleep while your mind can sort out the information. So that happens when people are tired and they're not processing information effectively, and the book sends them to sleep. It happens to dyslexic people, and they can go to bed early the night before. They can be really interested in what they're studying or reading. They can be having all sorts of healthy, correct regimes, but still there is text that repeatedly sends them to sleep. And when I started to get interested in what's happening in my dyslexic brain, I started to analyse the sorts of text that repeatedly put me to sleep. And here are some of them. In this piece, as the lens of a camera focuses an image onto the sensitive emulsion of the film, the lens of our eyes focuses a scene onto the sensitive cells of the retina that curves round the back of the eyeball. If you're a dyslexic person reading word by word, you don't know how to interpret the word as when you start that. It could mean at the same time as, it could mean in the same manner as. And it's not until you get well into the context that you know which way to do the interpretation. So one of the things that's observed in dyslexic people a lot of the time is that the eyes are going backwards and forwards over the text, much more than in non-dyslexic people's minds, eyes and reading. So that's something that happens. There's various errors within this piece. The lens of our eyes, well, I don't know about you, but I've got a lens in both of my eyes. So that should read the lenses of our eyes. It focuses a scene on the sensitive cells of the retinas that curve round the back of our eyeballs. It's not consistent, it's not completely correct English. And I find time and again when the words that I'm reading are incorrect, when the punctuation is poor, then there aren't the clues. It doesn't make sense as it flows into my brain, and I'm really struggling with the material. So the way in which things are written, the direct, correct language is very, very important. Also, I got through the censors a letter that told about how one of the boys who worked in one of my groups, John Kemeny, had been wakened up in the middle of the night and grilled with lights in front of him by some idiots in the army because they had found something about his father, who was supposed to be a communist or something. Kemeny is a famous man now. Now, how easy is that to understand as I read it? Easy or not? No? Because I was reading it as it's written. It's got no punctuation, so my voice was completely flat. What happens when you're talking is that the weight of the voice is used to give the meaning of the information that's in the passage. When you don't put the punctuation in there, when the pronouns are incorrect, then the text hasn't got all those extra clues, and it's very, very difficult to work with. So one of the provisions that's made for dyslexic students for their exams sometimes is that the questions are read, because the voice is then conveying a huge amount of the meaning. This was actually conversations recorded, so it wasn't written for good language. Another example of the sort of things that happens when dyslexic people are reading. These are two questions from a huge questionnaire. I've been fascinated with the dancing of flames in a fireplace. True or false? And you think, fireplace, oh, fantastic. Lovely, warm, true. The warmth of an open fireplace hasn't especially soothed or calmed me. Yeah, I just love sitting down there in front of the fire. It's absolutely great, wonderful, true. But actually, if you love the fireplace, and you need to notice that there's a negative in there, it hasn't. And if you love it, you've got to put false. And it's little words like that that don't get processed effectively. You think of the concrete situation and you don't take in the details of what the words have got, and so you misinterpret what's going on. Now this leads on to how important it is when working with dyslexic children and adults to actually express the positive, concrete idea that you want to get across to them, and not to wrap it up in ifs and buts and conditional clauses and the reverse of what you want to have happen. An example of that is one child I was teaching to ride a bicycle, one of the places where we would practice had a bollard in the middle of the path, and he obviously had to go in the gap beside the bollard. If I gave him the instruction, miss the bollard, he would hit it. If I gave him the instruction, aim for the gap, he got through. He wobbled, but he got through. So by naming the bollard as the concrete object, you bring attention to that in the child's mind, and that's what they aim for, that's what they go for, even if they don't want to get bruised every single time. So it is just that attention of what is it that you really want to have happen, and the importance of the positive creation of sentences, the positive writing of sentences. So that relates to, on the chart of symptoms and problems, reading problems, anesthesia, poor comprehension particularly. Okay, your turn again. This time I'm going to ask you to write while I give you a dictation. And to start off with this dictation, you can write with your ordinary handwriting until I say put in the curl. And then I want you to put this curl after every vowel or pair of vowels that make a single sound, or a consonant that is being used as a vowel. Okay? A soldier was marching along the high road. Right, left, right, left. And now put the curl in. He had his knapsack on his back and a sword by his side, for he had been to the wars and was now returning home. Why are you giggling? But I actually went slower. Yes?
Yes, of course, because we were trying to stop to put the
Yeah. So what's happening? Why does it suddenly get difficult?
I'm just concentrating on doing the curls. That's all I'm doing. Just finding the vowel and putting a
So I
finger
can't write down what you've said because I'm concentrating on putting the twit curl.
Yes. Yes. So what I'm doing is interrupting the automatic writing process that you have got that resides in the cerebellum at the back of the brain. And you're having to chop between the cerebral cortex at the front, which is immediate processing, and the spelling and the letter formations that you've got at the back, and you're chopping. That's what dyslexic people have to do a huge amount of time when they're writing. And it's that sort of effort, which you can see why, for a lot of people, the first way of writing essays would be much better to actually speak them into a tape recorder and then get their ideas from the tape recorder and put them down so that they've broken the thinking task from the actual writing task. Okay? You can see that while you're doing this, you're not processing the context. Yeah? So that means that when somebody is taking dictation, taking notes, they're not learning the material, they're not learning the subject at the same time. Whereas somebody who didn't have to do that extra processing, while you're writing, you're actually picking up the context, you're actually starting to learn the new material and the subject. So first writing is not first learning. When children have to write down the instructions that they're given of what their homework is, what PE kit they need, anything else they've got to get organised, they're not processing, they don't get the words correct, and so parents can't actually help them sort it out when they get back home. It's very difficult. And it stems from these sorts of writing problems. So on the symptoms and problems chart, this underpins all the writing problems. Bizarre spelling, because you haven't got time to think about it. Poor handwriting, because it hasn't become automatic. Minimal punctuation, because you haven't learnt where it goes. And also the simple words, and you have difficulty with writing checks because it hasn't become automatic. It also relates to poor comprehension on listening. And again, because you become aware that everybody around you is mastering these tasks and you aren't, that you've got ideas in your head that you're not able to express, then you get the emotional disturbances, the hyperactivity, the avoidance tactics that dyslexic people are known for. So that all stems from the difficulty of acquiring the automatic skill of writing. This is another writing activity, and with this one, what I want you to do is copy from the board exactly what is up there in your own handwriting. How are you doing?
Easy.
Sorry?
It's not easy.
Not easy. What's the difficulty?
Well, it's just jumping all over the place. I just don't know where the sentence is.
Yeah, don't know where the sentence is. No. What tactics is anybody using to do the task? Using the punctuation.
Reading the whole sentence and trying to remember the whole sentence.
Okay, so if you've got a short-term memory problem, which most dyslexic people have, you can't put the whole sentence together and work out where it goes. No? So what else was anybody using?
I was actually jumping all over the place like it was on the board.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so one of the in reading, dancing letters and lines, and this is mirroring this. The lines are dancing. If you've got no way of working with context, of holding several sentences, several words together to find their meaning, you haven't any way of processing where you've got to, of getting back to the place that you were copying from or reading from. So this is what can happen when dyslexic people are reading words that to you are on a single line. And it is very difficult to go from one plane to another plane from one side to another side. They find it very, very difficult to change the plane at which they're working. So one of the things that is suggested for dyslexic people is instructions. They're given to copy a printout on a piece of paper so that they can copy it straight, direct. If you're giving them PE instructions, the children need to be placed very carefully so that they're looking straight at the teacher, or they're looking behind, but they're not having to twist the instructions or to rotate from one plane to another plane. One dyslexic person I knew, in her work situation, used to find this sort of thing very embarrassing, because people would come to see her and she'd have to give them instructions to go to somebody else's office or to go to a car park. And she knew where doors, corridors, rooms were that were directly in front of her. She had no knowledge of what was going on side by side. So if she turned when a person needed to turn down a corridor, she lost all the information that was to her side that she'd just been talking about, and could now give information that was in that direction. But she actually could only deal with what was directly in front of her, and all space knowledge sideways completely was lost. And that's a similar sort of thing of the orientation effects that happen for dyslexic people. And that will relate to a lot of the problems, both in reading, in writing, in understanding what the world of language is doing. And it also makes it very difficult for automatic skills to do with language to develop in the brain. But as I said, it's not all doom and gloom, and there are some solutions. So I just would like to show you where one of them can be found. And to let you see about this, I'm going to ask you to do some drawing. First of all, I would like you to draw a plain, simple, symmetrical vase. Okay, so just remember that vase and how you drew it. And then I would like you to draw a vase in a very particular way. Now, can you all see this vase as either a symmetrical vase or as two faces looking at each other? Okay, so I want you to draw the first side of the vase by naming the different parts of the face: forehead, nose, lips, chin. And then go over again: forehead, nose, lips, chin. And then for the second side, forget completely about faces and just draw a symmetrical vase. Okay, so how easy was it to do that?
Found it quite impossible. I mean, wanted one bed to look alike. My trouble.
Who found it easy?
It was easier than drawing a symmetrical vase the first time, I think.
Yes. So what's easy about that?
I think it's because I was more focused on what I was doing.
Yeah.
So I focused very carefully on the face, and then I just literally copied it very slowly the other side. Whereas when I was trying to do something symmetrical, it isn't symmetrical at all, just and it's a more simple vase.
Yeah. So it was easier in the second size of this vase. You were just copying. What was going through your head as you do that?
Just to keep focusing on the other side so that I was doing the same thing.
And were you just focusing, or were you telling yourself to focus?
I was having to tell myself to focus on it, yeah.
Yeah, but that was all that was going through your mind. Okay. Yes? What? You look as if you're about to make a comment.
No, I found it quite easy to draw. I don't really recall being sort of focusing on the other side. I just drew the other side of the vase.
Just drew the other side. And what about the first one that you drew? You just drew?
Same really, yeah.
Yeah.
No, the first one was easier because you're saying the words. So as you're saying the words of the parts you were drawing,
That's the face side of it.
you just
Went down. Yeah.
eyes, nose, you drew it.
Yeah.
And the other side was harder because you were trying to match up.
Yeah. And what was going through your head as you did it?
Don't say the words.
Not to.
Because I've been told not to say the words.
Yeah.
But I found all this saying the words and then not saying the words just got in the way of drawing.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? Which is why I now do it, getting people to draw the simple vase first and make a comparison with that one. So what was going through your head as you did that very first one?
I was drawing a vase.
You're just drawing a vase. And any words? No.
Just keep it symmetrical.
Yes,
Trying to get it symmetrical. But were you telling yourself to get it symmetrical? Or you just how it looked? Yes. And I mean, this comes out of a very good book, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain by Betty Edwards. And that is her complete exercise. And I always find that it's very useful to compare it with what is happening in this situation. Because when you are drawing and focusing on the drawing, particularly when you're doing life drawings from objects, you're working on the holistic side of the brain, the right side of the brain, and that's part of the brain that doesn't think in words. It thinks in pictures, it can think in rhythms. There's a whole range of different ways in which you can think holistically, but specifically, you don't think in words. When you're being analytic and naming the parts of the face, you're thinking in words, you're thinking in a linear sequence, and you're not so much thinking spatially. And the two different ways in which the sides of the brain think have completely different organisations. And a lot of dyslexic people are really quite creative, and a lot are very artistic, which means that they can hold quite complex concepts in their brains, but they don't hold them in a language-based system. They hold them in some other holistic sort of way. And the difference can be shown like this. When you're working in the linear way that language works, you have your idea and it gets completed, connects on to the next idea, which then gets completed, passes on to the third and on to the fourth. And each idea is finished before the next one starts. When you're working holistically, all ideas together, everything is in your brain simultaneously. That's how we all see faces. You don't look at somebody and say, hair, forehead, one eye, second eye, nose, mouth. Oh, it's a face. You look at somebody's face and say, that's a person. That's a face I'm seeing. So it's all there. Now, when you're working with ideas and you've got all those ideas in your head simultaneously, they're not separated. So you start a sentence here. It's intimately connected with this one over here. So you don't finish the sentence there. You jump to that idea. You then jump to this idea here, and backwards and forwards. They're all connected together. You don't see that you're jumping around. This way of thinking is very much faster than thinking in words. So you get the wonderful riches of dyslexic people's minds happening in this sort of way. You get sentences that don't get finished, either when speaking or when writing. You get people coming back from exams and talking over their exams with their tutors. And the tutor will say, well, it's all very well going from this point to this second point, but how do I know how you got there? There are so many steps in between that need to be put in. And the person will often say, well, I knew those. I could have put them in, but I wanted to get on and write something faster. I didn't see the need to put that down. It's so obvious. It's so directly connected. There's a range of ways in which dyslexic people's thinking stems from this holistic way of processing information. Once you realise that's how you think, and you know how to structure your ideas and keep them contained, or let them splurge about all over the way and then put them into a structure later, you can actually work with thinking like this, but you do need to know how to process it and how to keep it under control. And the riches that come from that is once you learn that you are a holistic thinker, you can start to use the spatial side, the other side of your brain, to hold information together. This is a sulfur tree. It's a memory aid. It contains all the information that is needed at GCSE level about sulfur. And the analogy that produced it was that getting sulfur is like a tree getting nutrients from the ground. So we have here the two sources of sulfur in the ground, and they're feeding up through the whole tree. So you have also the physical properties, because they're in the trunk. That's what the whole of sulfur is all about and where it all comes from. So that is very solidly in the base there. You've got the naturally occurring compounds, because that's where they're first discovered. In the head of the tree up here, you have got 3 different areas which belong to the 3 different chemical compounds that are used in industry, and they're like the leaves of the tree going off and being used in a wide range of different places. Now, if you've got somebody whose strength is in the visual side, the creative side of the brain, they've only got to sit there thinking in any exam or situation where they need to know about sulfur, okay, it was a tree, and I've got the information about the chemicals at the top, and it all comes back, particularly if they have dreamt it up from themselves in the first place and created it and done it. So that's one way in which you can start to look for the strengths of a person's mind and use them very deliberately in order to retain information in the mind and be able to recall it at will. Okay? So, another movement for you, another exercise for you, and this one is about movement. And in this one, I'm going to ask you to move your hands and your legs, but the instructions I give you will either tell you to move a right arm or leg, or a left one, or else I'll use port and starboard, or I'll use sinister and dexter, and I'll use blue and red. Left, port, sinister, blue, all go together. Right, starboard, dexter, red, and don't write them down. You've got to remember them.
She's not that kind of learner.
No, she's not, is she? Very nifty. You know, and why not? If you can think of a strategy that works for you, you use it. But in this situation. Okay, so sit squarely with your hands in your lap and both feet on the floor.
Will you give us the instructions again?
Left, port, sinister, blue. Right, starboard, dexter, red. Okay. Now, which brings me to a very important thing. If you're the only dyslexic person in the room, or maybe there's 2 or 3, but you haven't actually made contact with each other, so you're not supporting each other, you don't have the courage to say to the teacher, would you give me that instruction again? So that is something that dyslexic people don't have the ability to do because they want to hide their difference. So thank you for saying that. Very useful. Okay, move your left hand to your sinister shoulder. Straighten your starboard leg in front of you. And keep your left hand on the sinister shoulder. Hold your right ear with your dexter hand. Cross your left ankle over the other. Put your sinister hand on the blue side of your waist. Tuck your dexter foot under the chair. Stretch your port leg out to the red. Touch your blue elbow with your starboard hand. I actually can't do that. It's sort of, yeah, it's that. So what's happening? You're getting confused. You're guessing. Was anybody watching the person beside them to see if you could get some clues? Just checked. Yes. Yes.
But on
Yeah?
that last one,
On that last one.
you couldn't hold this one, so you thought you got it wrong. It must have been that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Very important.
I was addedly confused because in order to remember which port is, there's a story about the men who had supper and there was only a little port left, which is the port's red. So that to me gave a very...
Oh, yes, yes.
I do know about port and starboard and
Yes.
I sail.
Yeah.
It gave me this whole mixed message.
Yes. Very difficult to get rid of.
That's right, yeah.
Yes. And that is also, I mean, something that's very difficult to get rid of. If people have learnt that verbs are doing words, to add anything else like being or thinking or sleeping onto these doing words is extraordinarily difficult.
Once they get used adjectively.
Yes, yeah. Something, I mean, it's almost like dyslexic people's brains, the first thing gets set in stone, and trying to change that persists in that difficulty.
So I was always slow on those ones. Right?
Yes.
No, it's not, that's not
yes.
right.
Yes, absolutely. So you can see how being clumsy at sport, hand movements and thought movements not being coordinated comes about because you're not quick enough at interpreting the words that are giving you the instructions. Yeah? Okay. And I would say that the problems that dyslexic people have with movement and with space also happen in very parallel ways with time. A lot. And, you know, my bell's gone off because I have a problem with time. Even though I've got a clock in front of me, unless the bell goes off, then I'm not aware of what the time is. So to sum up, there are characteristic ways of learning, and dyslexic people in particular need to use their natural way of learning in order to master anything. And when I'm not either writing something fluently or if I'm not learning something new effectively, even which way to turn a key in the boot of a new car, it's everyday situations that can be problematic. So those are the sorts of signals to me that I need to take my dyslexic brain into account and treat it carefully and kindly. Because dyslexia is about a language skill that's unstable, unreliable, and incomplete. And dyslexia gets worse when you're under stress or your natural motivation is not being used. The Myers-Briggs system is one very good way of looking at a person's natural way of being motivated. And I find it extremely useful many times with students. So to recap on the Myers-Briggs system, there were in particular, the 4 mental functions. Sensing. The sensing part of communication is the hearing, the speaking, seeing and writing. The intuiting side is getting the meaning of ideas and concepts, collecting ideas together. The logic side is getting your spelling rules correct, knowing how to do essay plans, being able to work with syntax. There's a lot of logic and systems in there. The feeling side is the personal experiences, knowing what your own purpose is. Why am I listening to this? What's important here for me? Being aware of other people. Can the reader follow what I'm writing about? Can people who are listening to me follow what I'm saying? So those are the places where you're thinking about other individuals or yourself, but it's people-based. It's not the good and bad feelings that come out of the emotional side of being human. So those are the aspects of communication from the Myers-Briggs system. But each of those mental functions has a motivation connected to it. Sensing people respond to practical functional tasks. They like to do, they like to master skills, and they get lost when steps are missed out. Intuiting people crave inspiration. They find routines dull. They want their imaginations fired with exciting information and ideas. And if they get bored, they will find something that fires them, that uses their imagination. The thinking people are energized by logically organized material. They need to analyze a subject. They need to find its structure. They thrive on systems. And if a situation has no logic to it, no orderliness, they can get completely lost and completely switched off. Feeling people want to care about their teacher and their subject. That caring brings out their best and carries them over boring tasks. And if there is no ability, no possibility of caring within a subject, they can get switched off and lose their primary motivation. So for each of those, there are ways in which you can become switched onto the subject, and there are ways in which you can get switched off. And if your primary motivation is not being used, then for a dyslexic person, changing anything else about the educational situation doesn't make any difference. That primary motivation needs to be involved. Now, these motivations are not just about being dyslexic, they apply to everybody. But where it's particularly important for dyslexic people is because of the impact on the language. If you're a non-dyslexic person and you're not particularly interested in a subject or a task that you've got to do, your language doesn't drop to pieces. So your language keeps going, you can engage with the task, and you'll probably find some way in which your motivation can be brought in line with it and you can get engaged with it because you have been doing the job long enough for your brain to get working on it. Whereas when you're dyslexic, if your motivation isn't engaged, your language then starts to disintegrate and you've got two things working against you and you don't have a chance to get going at all. It's a little bit like trying to send a radio signal from one country to another. If the second country doesn't want the signals to come across, they put up a jamming screen and you get no information going across. That's what it's like for a dyslexic person trying to engage with something when they are not naturally working effectively and their best way of being motivated is not engaged with them. So one needs to look for that. Now I just want to do a comparison between dyslexia and non-dyslexia. Dyslexia is independent of intelligence. You get people at university with degrees who are dyslexic. You get people who can't read at all, who are dyslexic. So the non-dyslexic world divides into people who would never be dyslexic and those who've learnt language in a way that suits them, but without that they would probably have been dyslexic. There are people who are dyslexic because they haven't been able to learn language in a way that suits their brains, and they've got this incomplete language ability in their brains. Under stress, the people who would never be dyslexic, language is one of the last abilities that disintegrates for them. The people who have been able to learn by the right method for them, under stress, they start to lose language in ways that are very similar to dyslexic people. But you take that stress off and their language goes back to its best. They've only got one language system in their brains. Dyslexic people, even under minor stress, and actually sometimes under great happiness, they will lose their language ability. And then when the situation is relieved a bit and the stress goes, actually what's happened is that they've got energized into the language, the dyslexic language system, and you need time for that to simmer down, to get switched off before you can start operating in your effective language system, in the best language system that you have. So that incomplete language is sitting there in your brain just sort of waiting for you. So what do I mean by stress? The standard things that cause stress that happens in life, any of those. And what happens in our bodies under stress? There is chemical imbalances. And this produces incoherence between the different parts of our brains. There is emotional upheaval in the midbrain, which then causes a blocking interference between the two cerebral hemispheres and between the brain and the rest of the body. Because using language is about lots of your brain and mind and body all working effectively together. Stress can be external or it can be internal. And of the external causes, one of the things that can help dyslexic people most is being accepted that they are dyslexic and not questioned all the time. One student said to me recently that getting to talk to other dyslexic peoples, being accepted by non-dyslexic peoples as somebody who is dyslexic, then allows her to not have to explain her dyslexia all the time, but actually move on and start to look for the solutions. The internal causes of dyslexia, of the stress, are psychological characteristics, neurological effects, and physiological effects. But as well as being part of the stress, they are part of the solution, because what we need is creation of working thought patterns, creation of useful memories, recall of stored memories. And these will only happen by way of an individual's own mind strengths and the brain connections. So that's where the solutions come from, and why the way we organise things is so important. If we take no account of the differences between people, then we're left with a sort of muddle of people not being effective, not contributing from their potential. And it's a bit like the dirty water that you get in a paint pot at the end of the day when you've been painting. But if we can find some way of respecting individuals' characteristics and honouring their differences, then we can have a situation that is much more like this picture, where you can see the individual parts of the picture and you can appreciate the whole. And that's really where we want dyslexic people and the situation around dyslexic people to be, that they are accepted for who they are, allowed to use their own individual strengths, that they can do whatever adaptations are necessary so that they contribute and function fully in our society. So that's the end of A Taste of Dyslexia. And thank you very much for coming.